Hi, and welcome to The Fix, a podcast about Photoshop, Lightroom, post-processing, and the cool and creative things we get to do with our images after the shoot. I'm Sean Duggan, your host, and my guest this week is digital artist and Photoshop author and educator Scott Valentine, who's going to share with us how he uses experimentation and creative play to figure out what's really going on under the hood with Photoshop blend modes. Well, thanks for tuning in and joining me, everybody. I do appreciate that. And I also appreciate the fact that I have Scott Valentine joining me here today. Scott is a digital artist, Photoshop author, and photo educator. And he's joining us from the land of enchantment, New Mexico. How's it going today, Scott?
Pretty great. I actually love the weather. We've got some clouds and some rain, so I'm kind of in my groove here.
Yeah. Good forgiving weather.
Yep.
So in addition to a couple of really excellent books that you have authored, so we have one here. This is The Hidden Power of Blend Modes in Adobe Photoshop, and then kind of a companion volume that came out of that, The Hidden Power of Adjustment Layers in Adobe Photoshop. You also write a column for Photoshop User Magazine called Photoshop Proving Ground. And what was the concept behind calling that the Proving Ground?
So Photoshop Proving Ground came out of the fact that I really like to experiment with Photoshop. Early on when I was working with it, I was kind of known as the guy that would break Photoshop. I would turn all the settings all the way up. I would put in images that were way too big to actually deal with. I would run things over and over again, a lot of scripts and stuff. So I like to kind of run it into the ground. And so Proving Ground was a way to illustrate that. I take a very experimental approach. I like to isolate variables, and I like to see what comes out of it. And that's really what a Proving Ground is all about. Does this work and how?
Right. Well, I think, the ability to consistently break Photoshop is very useful in an alpha and a beta testing environment, because that's what the engineers and the developers need, is they need to figure out, where are those sort of weak spots, even if they might be kind of way out on the fringes of what people might do to it, but somebody is going to eventually run into that and cause a problem.
Exactly. Plus, it's fun as a user to know where those limits are. Not just so you can stay away from them, but so you can use them creatively.
Yeah. Well, I always tell people in classes and workshops, typically when doing the post-processing phase of, the photography workflow, is that, when you're trying something out, whether it's in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever software you're using, you never know what's too far until you've gone too far. You have to go and you have to push that edge, and you'll know the point. You go, oh yeah, I've gone too far. This looks horrible. But if I back it off 15%, then it's starting to look nice. So there definitely is an advantage in pushing those edges and experimentation.
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of value to be had in finding what things look like when they're broken too. And if you can figure out how to control that, then you've got another creative tool at your disposal. And it's just, plus it's just fun.
Yeah, totally. And sometimes, you discover things accidentally that you couldn't have even envisioned, but because you push it too far or something wacky happened, that you weren't intending, it can oftentimes create an interesting visual result that you might decide to kind of follow that creative path and see where it leads.
Yeah, as it turns out, most of the artwork that I've done in the past couple of years, including some stuff that I've been invited to speak about, came about from experiments. I was just trying to see how things behaved. Let's see if I can find an example here. Do you mind if I throw up a sample?
No. By all means, so go ahead and share your screen.
Let me get it going here. So here's an example of something of an experiment. I was trying to figure out how to use the threshold adjustment layer, and I didn't exactly know what it might be good for. But I took this stock portrait and by setting up a couple of adjustment layers, I found out that I could get kind of this nice silhouette. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. I wasn't real thrilled with the grainy texture on it, right? But one of the things that I really enjoy about experimenting is that I'm always surprised. So one of the cool things about this particular setup is that I discovered that I can change how the threshold command works. I've got a black and white adjustment layer here, and the model's hair has a lot of red highlights. So I figured, well, why don't I just use that to adjust what becomes visible and what's not? So I got some nice highlights there.
And let me just clarify for people watching and listening that the threshold adjustment layer in Photoshop, what that does is it will turn your image into either black or white tones. So you have only black or white. And the threshold refers to the point in the tonal range where that split between black and white happens.
Right. And it's somewhat based on luminosity values. There's a little bit more to it than that. But you can really think about it as a brightness cutoff. Anything that's darker than a certain level will turn black, and anything that's brighter gets flat white, and that's it. And so fortunately, with a full color image, you can take advantage of the black and white adjustment layer tool to balance the contribution of each of these colors. It changes effectively the brightness of each one, so that as I move some of the different color sliders, different features in the photograph come forward. So I got pretty far with that and thought, you know what, this would be a really cool thing to turn into kind of a stylized painting. So I took it a little bit further, and I used some of the smudge brushes that Photoshop had just introduced at the time. They're mixed with the bristle brush on the I think it's just called a bristle brush.
Yeah.
I used that with a smudge tool, and I was able to go in and paint over some of these areas that were really grainy and pixelated and get this nice dry ink effect, this dry brushed ink effect.
Can you zoom up a little bit closer to see sure. The texture a little bit closer? Because I can see a hint of it there, but oh yeah, that's really nice.
And you can see up in the hair here, I've got, this is just basically the smudge tool with the bristle mixer brush, pushing things around. And I didn't envision this when I started.
Yeah.
It was just, happy coincidence.
Yeah, I've run into so many situations in Photoshop where that's happened, where you start playing around and you come up with something that you couldn't have thought about ahead of time. All right, so you have written the book, The Hidden Power of Blending Modes, and what do you think is the most important thing for people to understand about blending modes, kind of in the big picture, especially like new Photoshop users? Because there are certain broad rules that kind of govern them in how they're grouped together. But what do you think is the most important thing that people should understand if they really want to kind of use blend modes effectively for their photographs?
First and foremost, they're non-destructive. So you can experiment with them to your heart's content, and you're not actually destroying or changing anything in your image. And that's actually a pretty powerful thing to keep in mind. One of the other things that I think people need to be aware of is that you can apply blending modes in a lot of different ways. You can do them on layers themselves. They can be applied to tools. You can apply them to adjustment layers, and that gets you a whole new complex way to manipulate the color data on your image. And so those are really the key elements. So it gives you some surprising results, especially when you start tinkering with blend modes on adjustment layers. You get a lot of power and flexibility. So those are the things that I really want people to understand when they first start tinkering with the blend modes. They're not going to mess up your image, and they give you a lot of power right off the bat. The way to think about them, though, is they're kind of like filters for your camera lens, right? They have a pass-through, and you can adjust the intensity by changing the opacity or the fill values. You can mask layers that have blending modes on them. And there's just an endless way to use them. You don't have to just apply them to photograph layers either. So one common thing to do early on, before we got some of the new dodge and burn tools and some different ways to mess with things, was to paint paint with various shades of gray on a blank layer set to overlay.
Mm-hmm.
And that would get you some dodge and burn based on the gray value that you were painting with. So obviously,
right.
Closer to black would get you a burn, and dodge would be closer to white. And there, you can do that with color also. So if you want to do color enhancements.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and if you took almost all of the tools away from Photoshop, you could still accomplish just about everything you need to as a photo retoucher just with masks, adjustment layers, and blending modes.
I never thought about it that way, but doesn't surprise me that you have kind of identified that part about Photoshop, because I know that you have your background in science, I think, maybe gives you a much deeper understanding of how a lot of this stuff works under the hood. I mean, I know in terms of blending modes, I'm very familiar with the visual look that they're going to give me and how I might use that in my photographic projects. Obviously I know how to modify it with opacity masks, etc., or the blend if sliders. But I think that your experience and also your penchant for experimentation and living on the edge, as it were, that has perhaps given you the opportunity to discover things about blend modes that most people don't even know are there. And that's what I really love about your book, is that there are so many cool experiments that you've put together showing what you can do and the cool things you can create, that is just really refreshing, because it's just sort of out of the normal blend mode track that I normally find myself in, day in, day out in my editing.
When you look at an image that has a need for some kind of adjustment, and you know that there might be something about blend modes that you can use, I like people to kind of hit the targeted areas instead of just cycling through them, which is what most tutorials will teach you. As a matter of fact, I think this is the very beginning of the book for me, was I was trying to find information on blend modes, and every tutorial that I came across said, well, do these kinds of things with your layers and then choose the blend modes and just cycle through them until you find one you like. And I thought, the engineers who wrote these filters knew what they were doing. So we should give them, some respect in understanding how those tools operate.
Right.
And that's when I started figuring out that blend modes really are just a set of functions. It's math.
Yeah.
And I like to say that to audiences that hate math, because you can kind of get them to understand math is equal parts intuition and logic, right? Frequently, you can look at mathematical problems, and if you've got familiarity with them as a language, you can sort of intuit what the answer is going to be. Where it's headed and what it's trying to tell you.
Right.
Blend modes are kind of the same thing. When you start tinkering with them and you look at them in a focused way, then you know what results to expect. And when you can expect results, you can predict results. Right. So now as you have a vision in your mind, it's easier to go down that list and say, well, I know I need higher contrast in this, or I want to desaturate, or I want something completely out of whack. Which ones am I going to choose? And that order might be something like overlay, or divide, or hard light, or even hard mix. There's something to be used for each one of those, or some useful way to put those into play.
Well, I think one of the big broad strokes ways that I like to think about blend modes, and when I teach workshops, this is what I try to pass on to people. And again, this sort of like from a photographic standpoint, I use them mainly for enhancing my photographs. But the engineers, the developers, they have grouped the blend modes into specific groupings in the blend mode menu, based more or less on what they do. So the blend modes that begin with darken, the general effect is always going to be darker than what either layer is on its own. Same thing with the lighten blend modes, that's going to be lighter. And then, of course, the overlay blend modes are a contrast enhancing blend modes, most of them, although things like hard mix do weird things. But like on a kind of a broad brush level, that I think for new users who want to use blend modes to enhance their photographs is sort of like I think, a fundamental thing to understand in terms of what's the general effect this group of blend modes may have on your image. And then, of course, you can noodle it even further to do other things.
Right. And the other thing that people should understand about blend modes is that there are a lot of variables going on. There are a lot of things that can change. And so when you start to experiment, and I'll show you some of the things that I've set up here in just a minute, it's important to isolate variables. It's important to focus on one thing at a time and keep track of it mentally. As we said earlier, some of those experiments, the points where things look like they're breaking apart, those are important. Excuse me. Those are important to keep in mind because in the future, you might have a use for that kind of effect. You know, what if you want something that looks really nasty and ugly for whatever kind of story you're trying to tell with your picture? Well, now you know where you can get it and how you can control it.
Right, yeah. No, that's a great point. That's a great point. Let me ask you a question about a particular blend mode that I personally have never found a use for. And you mentioned it earlier, and that is hard mix. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, you know, I think that there could definitely be a use for that in images that look more painterly or illustrative. But for just like photography, I've not found a use for it. Do you have any insights on that one?
Yeah, give me just a second here. I might have an example to show you, actually.
Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot with hard mix, but it just kind of like popped into my head since you mentioned it. You know, that's the one that I remember when it first showed up in Photoshop. It was not in the original version of Photoshop, the original roster of blend modes. And when it first showed up, I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. It's like a color posterization effect, but I'm not sure what I would use that for, other than a color posterization effect.
Well, I did have an example for it somewhere in here, but now, of course, due to my fantastic naming scheme, I can't find it at the moment.
Don't worry about it.
The interesting thing about hard mix is that it takes your color values and shoves them into cyan, magenta, yellow, black, red, and white.
Right. The primary colors, essentially, the CMY and the red, green, and blue colors.
Right. And that actually has some utility when you start changing the blend modes, right? So I actually have a recipe in my blend modes book for adding contrast with the hard mix mode. And it takes advantage of the fact that the opacity slider and the fill slider are different.
Yeah.
One's pre-multiplied alpha and one is straight alpha. And it depends on where those transparency calculations happen, right? So it's an order of operations thing for the geeks out there. But let me go ahead and share this with you real quick. So here's one of the experiments that I like to use. It's a full color spectrum gradient. It's got CMYK, red, yellow, RGB, whatever. It doesn't have a lot of brightness variation in it because I just want to see how the colors are affected. And the base layer at the bottom here goes from the upper left to the lower right, from green to green through all the rainbow spectrum. And then I rotated that 90 degrees clockwise. So I've got, kind of a cross pattern, right?
Yeah.
So the top layer, currently set to normal, nothing surprising. If I set it to hard mix, all of a sudden you get these patterns.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, and so what you can do is toggle this on and off and see how the patterns are interacting with each other, or how the two gradients are interacting with each other, to kind of get a feel for what hard mix thinks goes to each color. You can see in the middle of this one, I've got a big swatch of red. At the bottom, a big swatch of blue. I've got some magenta in the center here. And by the way, I'm a little bit colorblind, so if I call the colors incorrectly, just tell me.
Okay, all right.
But the point is here, I've got this pattern. So let's take a look at how hard mix behaves with opacity. You can probably predict what this is going to look like. As I bring the opacity slider down, that pattern starts to vanish, and we see the base layer. So it's doesn't seem too useful. Let's check out the fill. Completely different effect. And so now
interesting.
Yeah. The colors that the hard mix blending mode are giving you get smeared in this case. Let me zoom into a little bit here.
That's really an interesting little demo there, just because in normal usage, my experience with using fill versus opacity on a layer is that if I had a layer effect, like a drop shadow or a bevel on a emboss applied to a layer, let's say a graphic or text or something, that the opacity controls the opacity of both the layer content and its layer effect, whereas fill will only do the layer content and leave the layer effect alone and not affect it. So this is a new use for that I was not aware of. Very cool.
Yeah. And again, it's order of operations. Where does the transparency calculation happen in the whole function, right? So order matters. Something that's kind of surprising that I don't know if you can see on the webcast is there's a maximum right along this edge here. It's a bright spot where there's a transition from going into very saturated, lower saturated, and then you have a peak. And then you start descending back down into lower values, darker values, I should say.
It does have a really kind of lovely, soft three-dimensional look, though. At that point, that the shape of that color blend there.
Right. And these are interesting things. It might be something that something in your art calls for these very saturated blends that whatever. I'm not going to try and invent good uses for it here. I'm just going to show people how to get there. But the goal in showing this is that hard mix does have some utility, and it doesn't have to be just these solid boundaries. If I turn the fill all the way back up to 100%, you get these hard edges. If I zoom in, the kind of noise that comes in here has to do more with the mode. This is an 8-bit mode, so it's an incomplete blending. So that's another thing that hard mix is good for. Maybe it's completely academic, but when you see these nice soft transitions, if you see these edges, when you see these edge transitions, they're kind of spotty. Chances are you're working with 8-bit because there's missing information or stuff that the blending mode couldn't do the right math on. So let's see what happens when I turn this to 16-bit. Yeah, it's already multiplied this way, so it won't happen. But
yeah, right. It would have to be that way beforehand.
Right. So the gradient would have to have been built in 16-bit. So anyway, so that's one thing that you can use hard mix for, is to come up with geometric patterns, right? Which is kind of cool. If I start rotating this, let me hit Command or Control T and just start dragging this around, you can see the pattern distorts.
Right.
So, and then I know there's somebody out in the audience saying, well, what if I don't like the colors? That's just unacceptable. So then you can go to your black and white adjustment layer, add that in here, and now you can change the contribution of each of the individual colors. And as a matter of fact, I think I have. So this is just a set of radial gradients that I've got set up. And let's see if I can find there we go. This is actually starting off just as a black to transparent gradient set to normal blending. I added a curves adjustment layer, which let me pull this out and make it bigger so you can see the wacky curve that I applied.
Oh yeah, that's a thing of beauty.
Yeah, it's got this nice little sine pattern, right? And then I've added a color gradient on top of that, right? So now if I change one of these to, say, hard mix, now I've got these harder edges. And I could add a threshold command to that. Let's try threshold on top of it. And now,
interesting.
Yeah, so now I've got these patterns that I can develop if I'm careful. So at any rate, you can develop all these patterns. So let me turn this one off. And so here's another one. This is the same basic gradients, but you can see I've got a bunch of different adjustment layers filled in there. Some of them have different blending modes. This one's set to difference blending mode, and if I set it to normal, so you've got a completely different pattern.
Yeah, wow, that's a trippy looking pattern. Cool.
Yeah, and I've got all these mandala patterns set up that I just absolutely love to play with. Again, these are all based on the same original gradient. I've just changed the blending modes and added some different adjustment layers in there. Right?
Yeah, and that's cool.
Yeah, these are just a complete blast. So for graphic designers, should be eating up blend modes and adjustment layers. for no other reason than to generate all these different patterns.
Yeah. Well, it's cool though. For me, I am neither a graphic designer nor an illustrator, but I do like to do composites in Photoshop, and so I can definitely see creating graphics like that or patterns like that to use as some sort of element in a composite. It's mostly photographic, but it has those other elements there.
Right. Well, even for backgrounds, or if you wanted to build up, a special effect, you could use these things simply as a reflection in somebody's eye. If you've got a catch light that is a little too big and there's nothing going on there, maybe you can put a little pattern or something in it.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Cool. And so what about in terms of using blend modes for effects that you might apply more to photographs, like portraits and stuff?
Oh, okay. Let me show you one of the... So typical wisdom has it that there are generally 4 main blend modes that you would use for portrait retouching. Let me go ahead and duplicate this layer with Command or Control J, and we'll go through them. The first one usually is multiply, and this is the effect. I've just duplicated the adjustment layer itself, and you can see it adds an awful lot of contrast right away. Let me zoom in just a little bit more here. There we go. So right away, we've taken this slightly high-key portrait that's a little bit washed out. It's nicely balanced already, but say for your own purposes, you wanted it to have more contrast. You've dropped out some of the shadows. You've added some more richness into the skin tones. And you've done that just by selecting this blend mode up here. The next one that is typically used is screen, which has the opposite effect of multiply. They don't call it divide because there's another blend mode called divide that has a completely different function, but they are related. I can talk about that if we really want to get geeky later. But so we have multiply, which darkens, screen, which lightens, and then overlay, which is kind of a mix of the two. Anything that's darker looks like it's multiplied, and anything that's lighter looks like it's screened. And then the other one is soft light, which is a little bit more subtle. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between overlay and soft light, but they give a very similar. I like
to think of soft light as a kinder, gentler version of overlay.
Exactly. Now, with a lot of these, you're changing saturation too, but they don't always give you the exact look you want. So it's important to remember that with these blending modes, you've still got opacity and fill, like we talked about a little bit earlier. So let's go back to overlay. There's a lot of contrast, but maybe it's a little too dark in the skin. There's a little too much red if you like. So I'm going to double click and bring up the blend if dialog. And with this layer selected, I'll start sliding up. You can see those shadows are lightening up, going back to the original color.
Right.
So I'll hold down Option to split that slider. And now we've softened up some of those shadows a little bit. I can hit the preview button. I don't know if it comes across on the video very well, but the shadows
I can
still
see
have some detail.
It's subtle, but I can see it.
I'll zoom in right there. I'll make it a little more. There we go. So here's the straight overlay being applied, and this is after adjusting with blend if.
Mm-hmm.
You can see more detail. It brings back the shadows, but I haven't touched anything in the highlights. Those can also be adjusted if you just want to mess with the midtones. So you have a lot of control over how the blend mode is applied. There we go.
Yeah, and then to clarify for people, to bring up the blend if sliders there, you can just double click on kind of the blank area of a layer, just kind of off to the right of where the layer name is. Or you can go up to the layer menu and go into the layer style blending options command to find them.
Right. So that's something that is actually very useful for photographic elements, right? You need to enhance contrast. You want to smooth out skin tones. Most of the basic enhancements that you'd want to do, you can do this way.
Do you ever use, what you've done here is you've duplicated the background layer and you're just applying these blending modes to the background layer. I found that for, certainly for multiply and screen, and I assume that the same would be the case for overlay, is that you can get by with just a levels or curves adjustment layer that you don't make any adjustments to at all, but then you just change the blend mode of that and it has the same effect.
Yep, it's like your Psychic. That was going to be the next thing I showed.
Okay.
Instead of duplicating the layer, you can just add most of the adjustment layers and change that blend mode. And like I said earlier, that's a great way to get you some additional power. So if I've got overlay on this, you can see it behaves just as if I had duplicated the layer. But now I can go in and change the tone curve directly. And so I've got two tools in one.
Yeah. The other thing that I like about doing it this way, I mean, obviously having the actual adjustment functionality there is a big plus. But since it's an adjustment layer, rather than duplicating the background layer, is you're not immediately doubling your file size.
Right. Plus, it already builds in the mask for you, so it saves you a step if you're going to do some masking. And like I said, you can actually stack these up. So you could put in several. Let's do a hue and saturation adjustment layer, and we'll set it to multiply. And if I lower its opacity a bit, there we go. Then I can adjust the saturation of that blend just a little bit.
Nice.
That one's a lot more subtle.
Yeah.
But, you get some of these other controls built into it. So, now she's on a gray background, right? And I could grab a brush, and let's make sure I've got the right kind of brush. Here we go. Make a nice large size. Okay. And use black as my foreground. I'm going to paint over her face here. And so now we've got a gray background without having to mess with compositing.
Yeah, and the other thing that actually just occurred to me right when you started painting there is it almost was creating almost like a lighting effect on her face, like there was like a little soft, spot shining down on her face there.
Exactly. Oh, there we go. So, and again, and I like to think that most people who are fluent in Photoshop got there by making mistakes. And not trying to fix those mistakes, but understanding where those mistakes happen and how they might be useful in the future.
Yeah.
And so,
what I like to do sometimes is, and I'm sure that this is behind, most of your experimentation, or much of it anyway, is that I like to do sometimes what I call a Photoshop road trip. And the Photoshop road trip is I just get in the car, which is Photoshop, and I drive. No destination or plan. I just basically open up images and I start to play around, and I have no preconception about what I'm doing, what I'm supposed to be doing. I just get in the car and I go. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great way to do things. That's actually how I came up with. Let me pull up another image here. So here's a result that I'm really, really happy with. It was exactly along the lines of a Photoshop road trip. I had a stock image, and I was looking at some flourishes, some vector art on a stock site, and I thought, wow, I'd really like to build this thing up and make some depth. How do I put all these things together? And at the time, I was actually testing some of the features in the clone stamp tool. And so this was the result. It was completely unexpected, but I really, really like it, and I've used this to great effect. And as a matter of fact, the same technique that I used to create this overall layered look, it was the foundation of a oil paint simulation that I did for Adobe a couple of times. It was the exact same type of technique, just slight tweaks in the parameters. But I didn't imagine this. Image. Thanks. I never imagined this when I first started. It was just, again, it was a happy accident, to quote Bob Ross. Or I'm sorry.
You zoom? Can you? Bob Ross. Happy trees, right?
Yep.
can you zoom up like on her leg there? The foreground leg, her thigh there, because just the structure there is amazing, because it really looks like her leg is made out of this fine filigreed flourish pattern.
Yeah.
And you got some shading in there as well. That is just really exquisite.
Thank you. This is something that I couldn't have imagined. Now, there are a lot of artists out there who can picture exactly what they want the end result to be, and then they start figuring out how the tools work, and they put everything together. I came at this from exactly the opposite side. I said, what if? I took a stock I took a stock image. I took the clone stamp tool and I created some custom brushes with these flourishes. And I just started tinkering. And it took a few iterations, but this is the very first result of that tinkering. And from this came a bunch of other techniques. I had no idea what I wanted.
Yeah.
That
is beautiful.
Thank you. So this is the value of experimenting. And this actually, relates to blend modes, because I discovered that in this particular technique, I could have blend modes applied at the stamping source level. So if you're not familiar with how clone stamps work, get in there and start tinkering with them. But what I found out was that most people use clone stamping for healing brushes, correcting defects in an image, or maybe sometimes doing things like face swapping, right? Kind of basic approaches. This was actually developed by opening two images side by side and taking advantage of the fact that you can sample a source from another image. So I used that as kind of my painting source. So I opened up the stock image and I created a bunch of different layers, duplicates, some of which were blurred, some of which had other filter effects applied to it. And then I put a layer at the top, and I set that as my clone source, so I didn't have to keep resampling all the time. And then I just turned layers on and off and changed blending modes to get all this depth. You can see some of these areas have blur to them. And that's because the source material, the layer was blurred. And then I turned it off, and I got some of these sharper areas.
Interesting.
If you look in the layer stack, some of these have drop shadows on them. That I've probably rendered the top edge of this, so you can't see if I turn them on and off. Let's see. Yeah.
Let's. Why don't you turn some layers on and off, and let's kind of look at what their effects are.
Yeah. So the thing to notice in this particular image is that my layer stack here is almost all set to normal blending, except for the layer effects themselves. All the blending that I did for these selections came from the source image being manipulated in some way.
I see.
So if I back all these down, let me go ahead and just start from the basics. All right, so I've got a background that I was just playing with. And this is a reference layer, so I knew where to stamp. And so that doesn't necessarily make it through to the final image. There we go. And so I was just.
And so again, your source is another document of this stock photo of the dancer that, and you had several layers in that you had applied different effects to using filters, blurring, blending, and then you were stamping those into this document. Is that correct?
Right. And through this process, I actually learned that it does sometimes make sense when you have a brush. Let me choose a live layer here. Brushes actually take blending modes, right? And so does the clone stamp tool. So here's a clone stamp. You can paint with all of these different blending modes that are up here. But the distinction is when you apply a blending mode to a layer, it's taking everything from underneath that it can see and comparing it with what's on the canvas currently. Right? So that makes sense. The difference with the tool-based blending mode, like when you change it on the brush, is that the blending mode that you select here only affects what's already on the canvas. So your first, let's say you're painting with basic paint. Let me go ahead and hit a new, open this up. Okay, so I'll fill it with white. And I'll choose another color. Let's choose a neutral color so it doesn't really affect much. There we go. Turn the flow up. Okay. I've just made a mark. Now, if I choose multiply, there's nothing underneath it to compare with, so it's just going to paint a gray stroke. But when I paint back over it again, where there's an overlap, it gets darker. Right?
Right.
And so the first stroke looks like it's painting on normal blending mode, and then subsequent strokes get darker and darker. If I go back to an unpainted area, I've got my original color back. So the difference there to keep in mind is that when you apply blending modes to layers versus tools, layer blending modes take into account everything that's already in your layer stack, and tool blending modes only apply to what's already on the canvas or on that layer.
Right.
So, and that's actually how I got to some of the effects that are in here. In some cases, as I was stamping, the stamping tool was actually set to multiply or screen, depending if I wanted lighter or darker. And then, some of them have drop shadow effects, so they've got more depth. This is one I think that I painted in screen mode, so it would brighten up.
Yeah.
And then I just kept building up from there. But there was no plan in this. I had no idea what it was going to look like when I was finished.
Yeah. Wow, great result. I mean, really just stunning. Have you made a print of that image yet?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think I made three reference prints, but I've given them all away.
Yeah. I can, that sort of image, I think, would really shine like as a large metal print. I can really see it.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Stunning. Yeah, it would really look nice. Oh, that's excellent. Cool. Well, thanks for showing that one.
So again, this was, I had no idea. It was just experiments. And if there's one thing that I can get people to do, it's to be brave. Try these things out. They're just pixels. You're not going to, if you can actually destroy your computer by messing with Photoshop or pixels outside of the installers, then I will send you a Snickers bar. But short of that, just experiment. Try.
Yeah, I mean, play is such a vital part of the creative process, and sometimes you do have to just get in and play with the tools and play with the materials, and sometimes you discover things that can be very beneficial to your normal workflow.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so where can people find more of your artwork to look at out on the web?
Yeah, I've actually got the easiest thing to do would be go to Skoxel.com, SCOXEL.com. And that will have links to all the other media that I've got online, Behance, ProSite, or whatever it is now, Portfolio. I have a photographic gallery that I typically use for showing client work. I don't have a whole lot of outward-facing stuff on that particular site, but it's on a Zenfolio site, which is it's actually a pretty good company to work with. I share an awful lot through the Facebook pages, though. So if you just follow me on Facebook, you'll eventually see everything that I post.
Right. Yeah, I think that's where I saw that image of the dancer the first time around.
Probably, yeah.
And could you say that URL again, because the sound cut out? Just it's SCOXL?
XEL.
SCOXEL. Yeah, we'll have that. I'll put a link in the show notes, and we'll stick a little banner on the page where people will see that. So cool. Excellent.
Here, why don't I write that out for you? And
well, all right, Scott, thanks for coming by and sharing those cool techniques with you. If I didn't have so much other stuff on my plate today and other projects where the deadlines are chasing me, I would love nothing more than to just sort of spend a couple hours and just take one of those Photoshop road trips.
Oh, I love geeking out on this stuff. It can be a serious time sink, though.
Oh yeah, definitely. And out there in internet land, if you are interested in learning more about this, I definitely highly recommend Scott's books, The Hidden Power of Blend Modes in Photoshop, and then the other one here is The Hidden Power of Adjustment Layers in Photoshop. And apropos that book, Scott, I was looking through this in advance of getting together, and I turned a page and I came across one of my own images. And I had totally forgotten that I contributed that image and a technique to this book. I went, oh yeah, cool.
Hey, you're in there. Katrin Eisman is in both books, I believe. I have some stuff from Julianne Koss. There's a lot of really power hitters that were very generous with their time and wisdom to share with people who pick up my book. I was pretty humbled by that.
Yeah. No, they're definitely great books. They're great books. All right, cool. Well, thank you very much for stopping by. Definitely appreciate that, and look forward to catching up with you at some point in the future, and maybe deconstructing another one of your excellent artworks.
Oh, yeah, I look forward. I'll get something interesting together for you.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot. Well, that wraps up another episode of The Fix. Hey, if you're listening to this or viewing it on our website, thisweekinphoto.com/thefix, please subscribe to the show using the box on the right side of the webpage. And you can also sign up for our email list, and that will get you notifications about when new episodes air, as well as some additional subscriber bonuses. You can get in touch with me directly and provide feedback, comments, or suggestions for what you'd like to see on future episodes of The Fix. Just use our contact form, and you can get to that by going up to the top of the page and clicking on the Contact Us menu item. And when that form opens up, just make sure you open up the little menu and specify which show you're providing feedback on. And of course, for this show, you're going to be choosing The Fix. I'm Sean Duggan. Thanks again very much for tuning in and joining me. We'll catch you next week on The Fix.